It feels like recently we've seen a return of a certain mythological creature that we all love, vampires. We've seen films like Sinners and Nosferatu doing amazingly at the box office, especially in regards to how much it costs to make those movies. So is it true? Are vampires coming back around? And why are we so obsessed with vampires in the first place? More specifically, why am I so obsessed with vampires in the first place? Welcome back, everybody. Some of you might be kind of new to the channel. I did a review on Sinners recently that brought in a lot of new folks, and I thought this would be a good opportunity for me to sit down and chat to you about one of my favorite mythological creatures, monsters of all time, and that would be the vampire. So what is it with vampires and why are we obsessed with them? Why am I obsessed with them? Well, you may have noticed my name on the channel. Well, the name that you see everywhere is probably just my name, Amanda McKnight. So you'll see that everywhere. But it used to be that the username was more prominently featured, and the username for my channel is VampX13. I have thought about changing it to just my name because that's a little bit more SEO friendly, but VampX13 is actually a username that I've had for a very, very long time. Since basically the dawn of the internet, as someone who myself is a vampire who is just shy of 900 years old. Now, why is vamp my username? What is that about? Well, if you didn't know this about me, I love vampires. And this is an obsession that has started for me from a very young age. So I thought it would be cool to talk about sort of our obsession as a society with vampires, what these monsters kind of represent for me, but also just, I think, for a lot of people, and why I find myself so attracted to stories with vampires in them. Well, other than the fact of movies, which I could get into, but I'm not going to focus on right now, because where I think it really started was actually my love of Anne Rice. And I bet, looking at me, that most people would not have guessed that Anne Rice was where it began. In fact, I feel like more people guessed that Twilight was where it began for me. We're gonna talk about Twilight. But first, let's talk about Anne Rice. So if you don't know, there's a series of books called The Vampire Chronicles written by Anne Rice, and they're all about these stories of these vampires. It's a whole cast of vampires that we get to know, but at the center of it, I would say, is the vampire Lestat. In fact, there is even a novel called The Vampire Lestat. It is not actually the first book in the Vampire Chronicles. That would be Interview with a Vampire. When I was younger than I am now as an immortal being, I did watch Interview with a Vampire, and that movie definitely was a hit for me. But I think I started reading the books first. I started reading the books, I hadn't read all of them. Then I got into the movie. Then I got into Queen of the Damned, which is another movie based on the Anne Rice books. Not as good, admittedly, but for nostalgia reasons, I do love Queen of the Damned, even though it's very different than the book. The movie for Queen of the Damned was not as good, not as accurate, and no Tom Cruise as Lestat. And honestly, although Interview with a Vampire is a weird movie whenever I come back to it now, to think about even just that cast, to think about the fact that we had Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt acting as kind of these homoerotic vampires in this movie. It's pretty crazy to think that that happened, and it just happened in the 90s. That was definitely a moment for me. The movies, the books, and I think what attracted me so much to these characters. I was a big Vampire Lestat fangirl when I was younger. I even wrote fan mail to the Vampire Lestat, which I will not show you, but which, yes, I do still have. But of course, never mailed it, because where do you mail that? Vampire Lestat at the back of the book does not have like a mailing address. Like, yes, I am the Vampire Lestat, and I see that you would like to send your fan mail to me. This is my address. That was the character that I was the most connected to. And I think it was something about this idea of Lestat kind of wanting to be seen, the performer within him that I really connected with, the glamour of Lestat. Really, what Lestat is about is he just really wants to be loved, this character. And it's a bit of a curse, though, to be loved and to be desired by so many. In a way, it keeps you from people, if that makes sense. It's like when you get to a certain level, like if we're talking about Lestat when he's a rock star, he's kind of at a level where everyone wants to be with him, everybody wants to connect with him, and yet because of this, he has like this barrier between him and people. So it's this idea of wanting to be vulnerable as a performer and connect with people, but also how the bigger that you get, the less connection that you can really get on a personal level. I think that was something I found so fascinating about that story, or that like now as I've gotten older, I've come to realize how that even can pertain to myself, which is crazy. The interesting part about vampires is that across history, there have been so many different stories in regards to the folklore of vampires. Something that I actually really appreciated about Sinners is that Sinners is a movie that really explores the mythos of vampires and also adds some layers to it. I like when we don't just present vampires in a typical sense, and when someone that is writing or filmmaking, someone that's working with vampires, kind of tries to find something of themselves to really bring to that story and to add to the mythos. Doesn't have to be necessarily even new, but just bringing new layers, like the idea of vampires being cut off from their ancestors. It's not necessarily a new concept, but the way that it's interpreted through Sinners in terms of the connection to music and how music connects us to our ancestors and everything that's come before, so vampires can't really connect with music in the same way, is a really freaking cool concept. Definitely not something that Anne Rice was doing, but I love it. I love that it's doing something a little bit different and how it just weaves into the themes of that story. I think for me, when I fell into the pit that was Anne Rice, I also just started to get really interested in vampires in general. And I think what I love about them is that there are so many things that they can represent depending on the story. I fell into this idea of exploring in different countries and in different areas of the world what the myths were and how that also informed on the cultures that they came from. And then I just got really into folklore and I got really into mythology, and all of these things sort of opened up to me as someone that has loved exploring different areas, cultures, and histories of the world. For those that don't know, I'm actually based in Canada. So it was also interesting because in Sinners, I've loved hearing more about American history, African American history as well, and just African history as well. Like there's so many things that I am just not as well versed in because of where I'm based. Now I did take American history when I was in school for 1 year, so I know a bit about American history in terms of like how America was founded and all that stuff, but I didn't take it throughout all of school because I'm not American. So my my knowledge is somewhat limited. So it was really cool seeing people coming in and sharing that stuff. And it's also really interesting to me when people come in and just assume that I should know it all already. I think because people assume sometimes that I'm American, but just to clarify, I'm not. So if I don't know something about another culture, I apologize in advance, but it is something that I love learning about. So if there's ever anything that you guys want to share with me in regards to that, share your factoids about vampires and other myths and folklore from different cultures, because I love to hear about it down in the comments. From my love and expansion into mythology, the mythos of vampires, I went into a place where I looked at Bram Stoker's Dracula. I got back into some of the classics. Of course, what I didn't know at the time when I was reading the novel, Bram Stoker's Dracula, not to be confused, by the way, with the movie Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a totally different vibe. Although I've also watched that movie, and I'm not gonna lie, the nostalgia for that movie, I do love it, even though I don't think it's a perfect film by any means. The thing I never realized when I was reading Dracula was that Dracula isn't even, we think of it as being one of the first vampire tales, but there's actually one that's a little bit older than it, and it is called Carmilla. And while I haven't read the novel, I was in a play. I'm also an actor, by the way, for those that don't know that about me. I was in a play that was an adaptation of the book Carmilla, which is about a female vampire. It's also very gay, which I also really liked about it. And it's a really great story also that kind of examines this idea, at least in our adaptation of it, of, how Carmilla, the vampire, is not necessarily a bad character. We kind of treated the vampires there as like othering people, and what happens when people just don't accept you because you're different. And I think monsters can be examined a lot of times under that lens, under the lens of racism or even homophobia, and you can use vampires to kind of stand in for some of those things as well. Speaking of that, there have been a lot of properties that have done elements of that, and some that just keep it more typically supernatural. To give you some of my favorite things that I fell in love with through the years. So in the 80s, there was Lost Boys, and in the 90s, I had Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the show, Interview with a Vampire, Blade. There's a lot of amazing vampire properties that came out in the 90s, and I think all of them are also part of the reason why I love vampires still today.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
There's also the 2000s vampires. We had Underworld, which I really loved, exploring the universe of, even though I don't think that's quite as good as some of the other vampire stories that I've gotten into in terms of world building, but still, Underworld was a thing. There is Queen of the Damned, obviously, which was a movie that happened. Also, shoutouts to actually Aaliyah, who played Akasha in it, and I thought was amazing. Rest in peace, Aaliyah. But she blew me away as Akasha. I felt like she was very well cast. Also, Twilight happened, and I'm not gonna deny, okay, I've read all the Twilight books. You bet I have. I think I maybe still, I don't know if I gave them away or if I still own all of them, but I read all of them, I watched all the movies. Twilight is not my favorite vampire property. In fact, I actually like the werewolves more in Twilight. I was very much a Team Jacob person, so interpret that as you will. But the vampires in that world and the idea of them sparkling and all this stuff, I thought was a little much. I do love that Twilight's having a resurgence though now, with just a lot of people going back to those movies and kind of watching them for nostalgia. And we can all kind of acknowledge that they weren't great. But, you know, Twilight, what it was about is it's a page turner. Even when I was reading it when I was younger, I knew it wasn't good literature, but I just couldn't stop reading it. So that's where I stand on Twilight. And then in the 2010s, we also had some pretty great vampire properties, starting in 2008, but had like 7 seasons, I think. True Blood. I freaking loved True Blood. In that, the vampires kind of are a stand-in for, you know, like what we were doing with Carmilla, this idea of these monsters being in the deep south and being a bit of a stand-in for racism or just other groups that are, you know, looked down upon or kind of pushed to the side. And that's kind of what the vampires are going through. And in True Blood, you know, the vampires say, like, we just want to coexist with people because vampires are public there, which also adds a whole other layer to it. I really liked True Blood as the show. I could never get into the books. And I will say that I wouldn't recommend finishing True Blood because I did not like the ending of that show. But the characters and everything it was doing with the world building I thought was really interesting. Vampire Diaries also existed. I never really got into it. Vampire Diaries for me kind of hit a similar note as Supernatural, unfortunately, where I'd like to kind of get into some of those shows, but they all look like they were filmed in the same dark room for each episode. I don't know if that's only early seasons, but yeah, let me know if you think Vampire Diaries is something I need to revisit, because I know a lot of people that love it. There's also What We Do in the Shadows, the movie happened, and then I got very much into the show, and I've loved that show since the beginning and loved the movie since I first saw it. I think What We Do in the Shadows is such a fascinating study on vampires. It's hilarious, but 2, there's so much humanity through those vampires, and I think when it comes to what I love really about vampires and monsters in general is this idea that we are exploring our humanity through the monsters. It's like a dark mirror you're holding up to yourself to reflect back what in you is human and what separates you from that dark side. And what I love about monsters too, that with most monster and vampire movies, even if you're bad or you're evil, there is some kind of chance for redemption. Maybe minus like Nosferatu, which I also have to admit, after I got into Anne Rice and then Dracula, I went back and I watched the original Nosferatu film. So when they were redoing it recently, which also was done by one of my favorite current filmmakers, Robert Eggers, I was obsessed because I watched Nosferatu quite a while ago. I watched the original movie, and then I also watched the Nosferatu movie that's about the making of the movie, which also, can I just say, that movie feels like a fever dream. I've watched a lot of Nosferatu stuff as well, and I think other than Nosferatu and maybe like 30 Days of Night, and there's probably a few other depictions of vampires out there, but I think other than those, even, I would say, even kind of with Nosferatu, I think, there's this idea that monsters can be bad and do bad things, and at times be evil, but there is a humanity in all of them, especially when you have monsters like vampires that were once human, if that is the folklore you're going with. Not always the case, but if we're going with that folklore, there is something still within that monster that is representative of the person they used to be. And if you can just reach that, if you can bring that out in people, there is a humanity there. And there is humanity that sometimes vampires fight against. I mean, when we look at Louis in the Vampire Chronicles, he is filled with so much like humanity. It is insane. He has so much guilt and shame just surrounding what he is. And what I love is that the idea of a dark side with a lot of characters allows us to kind of come to terms with our own dark side and wrestle with what makes a person good or bad, what makes a monster good or bad, what makes someone a monster. And I just think that concept is so fascinating. Also, when I was talking about Sinners, that is part of the reason why I wanted to talk about some of the humanity of the vampires that I liked in the movie. I think the lead villain in that movie, Remick, the interesting thing is that while he is the antagonist of that story, I also feel like in general, he's not necessarily a bad person. He also was turned into a vampire and this happened to him. And yes, he's doing everything he can to get to Sammy to connect to the music, and he's messing with so many people to do this, which is very evil. I'm not going to disagree, but I just feel there was still a humanity to that character, and there is a story about where he came from and why he became this and how he was also oppressed, which I think is fascinating, and how it's a question of what makes us monstrous, what turns us into monsters, and where is that fine line, and can you come back from it? That's why I love vampires, and that's why my username is Vampex13. And that's why I think we as a society really connect with monster stories, because we get to examine the monster within ourselves in a space that feels safe. Whether that's vampires for you or werewolves, a lot of different monsters do this stuff, ghosts. I think with vampires, we're also exploring a lot of themes in regards to our sense of a sensual expression, love of one's body, desire, how we relate to desire, shame, and things like that, which are also explored in Robert Eggers' Nosferatu quite a bit as well. And a sense of freedom, but also at a cost. This idea of living forever, but in a way giving up your humanity. What does that do to a person? Anyways, those are my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed this video and that I didn't talk your ear off too long. Let me know what some of your favorite vampire movies and stories and books are. I would love to hear more about it. This also isn't everything that I've been into that's vampire. This is just some of the stuff that came to the top of my mind when I made some notes for this video. So keep in mind that I haven't mentioned everything here. I mean, there's definitely more that I could talk about. There's some other books that I've read that I love with vampires. There is, Vampirella as well, who's a vampire from outer space. In her original story, she is from Dracula, which is a whole planet with vampires. It's a whole thing. She's like an alien vampire. So there's a lot of different takes on vampires out there, and a lot that I've loved. But let me know if you have something down in the comments. Maybe you'll surprise me. Maybe you'll introduce me to a new one. I'll see you down there. And if you missed it, I did do a review on Sinners. You can check out my full review over here. Highly recommend it. It is an amazing movie. And hopefully we'll talk about some more vampire stuff soon. I'll see you then. And until then, friends, stay nerdy. Bye!